all yours.
Thanks, Hugh, for the introduction, and hopefully folks online can hear just fine. I'll just say to the audience online that I'm toggling between two screens here. I think the audience here knows that, but it may get a little funky every once in a while, and just bear with me. But I appreciate the invitation to come down. I know that the California Fire Science Consortium has tried for a while now to get me to come and talk, and I think I got duped into this one, but I'm happy to be here. It's great to spend the day with you in the lab, and hopefully at some point I can come down and visit the rest of the folks that are online at Berkeley, and I guess there's some folks joining from elsewhere in the world too. So that's pretty exciting. When Hugh hit me up about a topic, I thought, well, there's a bunch of things I could talk about, and a lot of my current work is more in the policy space, but I've been getting a lot of requests for more information on riparian burning, and obviously like oaks are a big part of the work that I do. And so I thought, you know what, like I'm just going to do this hodgepodge thing and throw it in here. So that's the caveat. Okay. That's where we're beginning with in this talk today. But super happy to be here. And I'm going to, okay, so I'm on the right screen and just say, like, when we think about Indigenous fire stewardship, I want to say, and we had a really great conversation today around lunch here on the quad here at Davis, talking about kind of the move of where and when the social acceptability and recognition of Indigenous stewardship kind of came into being. And I'll just say that it's truly been a long time coming, and that you know, in my early career when I worked on my dissertation research, whenever I talk about Indigenous fire stewardship, people would say, well, that's interesting. Like you study like the past practices of how fire was used in this landscape. And that was never necessarily my intent in how it could be used, because I could always have this very forward future thinking way of understanding, like, this is applicable today. It's applicable to the challenges that we face. And finally, we've come into a space, unfortunately, because of the catastrophic circumstances of many of the wildfires that we've experienced. That time frame in my mind is like 2017 through 2019 time period, mostly here in California, but also internationally in Australia, just to give some sense of that. To root that a little bit deeper, though, and to understand this is like fundamental to understand where Indigenous stewardship guides the way that that stewardship occurs, and recognition of the past impacts of wildfires that go back into like deep story time for Indigenous peoples. One of my elders shared with me, and this was actually you know, during my time here at Davis, I would spend like every Wednesday, I'd go out to Ione and visit with elders out there in the evening and have dinner, and we'd talk in language and do all kinds of fun stuff. But I would keep mental note of things that were coming up in the conversations. One of the things that came up in the conversation was, you know, this quote that's up here, that if people stop burning, that wildfires would become rampant. And this elder who shared this with me noted that, you know, this was something that one of her elders had said to her, and that elder was somebody from another Miwok community that was living in the early 1900s. So like this knowledge base has been there all along. And you know, if we're not burning, this is what's going to happen. And the pictures that you see in the background are some examples of that. The main photo on the left-hand side of the slide is the upper reaches of the Butte Creek watershed with the Dixie Fire footprint in it. We have the campfire down here in the lower right, and then in the upper right is a riparian burn that happened on the Sac River about 2 years ago. That's not so much, you know, to this catastrophic scale, so to speak, but it definitely gets to the point that these are places that would have been stewarded in the past and now lack that stewardship. So to bring us into a sense of what really guides this practice is one, it's rooted in a traditional understanding of story and place, that fire needs to be used within the landscape. And by reading the landscape and understanding the landscape for the indicators of when fire should be applied, then we can start to apply fire within that place. And this slide just kind of illustrates that with some of the ecocultural indicators that are used. In our conversation, as I referred to earlier today out on the quad, that conversation talked about condors a bit, you know, and so condors are a really important ecocultural indicator for a lot of tribes here in California, but actually across North America, we hear the reference of thunderbird, and in fact, thunderbird is one of those species that is noted to bring fire into the landscape. And I've heard this all the way up into like the interior plains areas of Canada. So like as a foundational species, it is really critical. And so when we think about the fire stewardship processes, it affects so many aspects of the system. And ultimately, that is the responsibility that we have to take care of places. And I'm toggling back and forth between screens here, so make sure I'm on the right one as I advance. What motivates me in this space has always ultimately been around conservation. And I think about, conservation of rare ecosystems. I think about, the species that are found in there. And as we think about some of our ecological systems and even more recently, like listings of species and proposed listings of species like our native bees and monarchs, as examples of that, there's ultimately a connection to this conservation value and how do we, best achieve that. So and I'm toggling back and forth here again a little bit, but some of those conservation concerns are driven by land use change as one of the primary factors of that, and some of the ecosystems I'll talk about today, particularly the oak woodlands and the riparian systems, that land use change has had a profound impact on their distributions and also how fire interacts with them, how frequently fire traditionally would have been in those places, and then what the concerns are going forward. And and then in the modern context, we can think about challenges that are posed by invasive species presence and what are the dynamics of those species presence in terms of guiding what fire might be. And then also thinking about, the role of altered fire regimes, the types of fire, the fire behavior that occurs in those places and those sorts of things. So as we think about that, these are kind of the main driving forces that I consider in that space. The other side of it is also then understanding like how the current fire magnitude and extent of those fires is influencing, our ecosystems. So when we think about fire magnitude is, the severity, the intensity of the fire, and how that affects species responses, but then also the scale at which it occurs. So, like we see an increase in higher fire severity happening in different places currently. And then the next thing is also then thinking about, the opportunities and the frequencies at which these ecosystems would be maintained to support both conservation values that are also the ecocultural values. And so in that consideration, we can think about the places that would have had frequent fire in the past, but haven't had frequent fire in the recent history, and what the ramifications are by not having fire in those places. So that takes me into thinking of some of those, and I'll start by talking about the riparian and how I got involved in doing riparian research in the first place. And in that, I gotta make sure I'm on the right one here. In that space, I began doing research in riparian forest kind of on a whim, in that I had been involved in a project at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve. Some of you here are probably familiar with the Tending and Gathering Garden, and I was a steering committee member on that project, and the opportunity came forward to, hey, what about if we were to set fire in the riparian forest? And I thought, hey, why we should be doing that. But this is something that, California Indians have been asking for state and federal agencies to do for generations, and nobody was willing to do it. And everybody would always say, well, these are wet systems, they shouldn't be burning. And those, we would need to have data on it, right? And so I thought, hey, that's a great opportunity for me as a person trained with Western science and this traditional knowledge to be able to blend those together to understand what the role of fire is. So there's a cultural, motivation in that, but also conservation motivation, recognizing that, these riparian forests in the Central Valley represent about 2% of what historically existed. So, we're dealing with a rare ecosystem, which, I've seen have pretty devastating fires in. And so what are the ramifications of those kind of fires and when we're not stewarding those places? So there's a riparian conservation concerns. And then, thinking about how that stewardship process might lead to better maintenance of these places. And so I did my dissertation research beginning in 2002 at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve and also at the Lockford Plant Material Center on the McCollum River. And comparatively looking at these two systems and pretty small burns, I mean, like the total study site was 6 acres at both sites. But they were the first burns that were really being done in an applied sense in riparian ecosystems. And what I think is interesting about it is that when we were in the midst of that work, one is like it's the first time it's being done, but and sometimes in generations, like there were no practitioners working with us in that space who had applied fire and riparian ecosystems for 2 to 3 generations that we knew of. And so we're using the knowledge of story to revitalize cultural fire into a place. And and it was all validated when that fire was being, set on the ground. Some of those indicator species started showing up as we were burning. And so like all of these things kind of check out in the long run around that space. Um, and so I think like that's a pretty powerful thing. But in terms of like thinking of like the outcomes of burning in this and kind of like what that initial study showed us is that one, that riparian systems are pretty resilient. They're pretty tolerant of a lot of things, and even like the worst, severe wildfires that we see in some places, all ultimately come back. They just may not have the canopy intact in the way that we're used to it, and may have an additional fuel load because there's like massive woody debris that's generated by it. Um, so I think that's a good, kind of beginning point. This is just showing a 1 year cycle. So one growing season, pre-burn in the upper left, rotating clockwise to spring, summer, and fall at the Cache Creek site. And we see that it's pretty responsive. Interestingly, like that forest litter that was on the ground, which was pretty thick in the pre-burn conditions, we didn't do much to reduce that before we burned. We reduce some of the ladder fuels because we weren't certain what the effect of the fire would be on the canopy. But the ground fuels we kind of left in place. But when we burned it off, like there was a flush of native grasses that responded. So we had a lot of native grasses, and then the willows started coming up after that. So pretty pretty interesting to think about that. What I want to say in terms of like the native species is like the timing of burn, which this was a early wet season burn in both cases, mostly focused on that. Although we had some summer and spring burns that we did also in the experiment. Generally speaking, like these species respond to fire, period. But if you want to steward for native species, your best response is to burn in that early wet season, given the conditions of having so many invasives in the space. Um, at that time, and this is the only chart I think I have to show you, but oops, wrong one, sorry, toggling between screens, is also looking at the effects of fire on wildlife. And so, what this shows us is that we have a greater diversity and abundance of those species in the burned areas. And here the focus is looking at small mammals and small reptiles. But like there's a diversity difference that occurs in these spaces. So fire at the right time can be beneficial both for the plants and animals that were in the study area. Um, I bring this up because it's interesting in the sense that at the time I did this work, like the thought in my mind was, well, what's the frequency of fire that would maintain the system? And I think in my dissertation, I don't remember exactly what I said number wise, but I want to say it was probably 4 to 15 years is what I said. And in the elapsed time, I've come to think about that a little bit differently to say it probably should be in the magnitude of about every 2 to 5 years, but with occasional burns that are occurring outside of that. So, I mentioned the two places, Cache Creek Nature Preserve and the Plant Material Center in Lockford. And those places didn't maintain those landscapes with fire. Those forests in the past 20 years have mostly reverted back to what they were in pre-fire conditions. And this is actually the next thing I want to share with you is that the Plant Material Center in Lockford was really interested in continuing the stewardship, but was a little bit reluctant to figure out like how to go about that, you know. And finally, in November of, I think it was November of 2023, we finally got to a point. It was like, we're just going to go out and burn it. And so we did. And at the time they were like, "Hey, are you gonna thin, the understory fuels out and that sort of thing?" And it's like I've got now much more career experience in burning in a lot of different vegetation types. And given the conditions that we're burning in, I'm not worried about the ladder fuel conditions. And we need sometimes a hot fire to do good ecological work. And so I said, no, I'm just going to come out with our burners and we're going to set fire. And we did. And this was very small. Like we burned in the riparian forest on this particular one just to try it out, about a half acre. And this is what it looked like. It's a very different fire than the fires that you saw on the previous slide, which are, low flames that are less than a foot height. These are definitely over my head. It's burning, piercing the canopy in some places. But this is what it looked like 6 months later. So we basically were able to use that kind of hotter burn condition to reduce the heavy debris in the riparian forest. And mostly what you see there is native species. We've maintained the sedge bed, which is actually cultivated culturally at that location, and a bunch of other cultural indicator plants that are there. We're still moving forward with this. Like this was the first go of it, but it got me thinking more about what are the opportunities for us to study first entry. I'll call it first entry. It's been 20 years now. Let's call it a first entry re-entry of fire back into the space, but to do some research around this. And I'm not in the midst of that just yet, but this is setting the stage for that. The other piece that I want to talk about is also, like the wildfire interest of it. And I've been generally less interested in wildfires. Like wildfires happen, they're always happening, and like I just kind of find it boring, to be honest. So I like to study things that I have a little bit more control over. But during the time I was doing my dissertation research, there was a wildfire that broke out on the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge, called the Pelican Fire. This was back in like 2003, 2004 time period. And I thought, well, here's an interesting opportunity. Like I can go out and study the effects of this fire and see, what it does. And I'll just say that this is where that initial idea of a hot fire and more severe, kind of fire might be interesting to look at. And what I found in that, and this is totally unpublished, one of these days when I retire, I get to publish some of this stuff, right? But is that the hotter burns actually had more native species in them and created a place where the seed bank that was deeper down in the soil was released and all the weedy garbage at the top was burnt off. And so for a short time period, we had a pretty good, native crop there. And then slowly it reverted back. So keep that little seed in your mind as I dive into the next few slides here. So I'm gonna now transition to talking about the oak woodland stuff. And just point out, like, obviously, if you're familiar with California Indian culture, you know that there's a strong relationship between oaks and native peoples across the state, for a variety of reasons. But obviously, food is like pinnacle to that, and acorns are not only important culturally to people, but also a really important food for wildlife. So these are just some examples of those relationships of food, and fiber and toys that come from the riparian, or sorry, the oak woodlands. Ultimately, this is a representative of the stewardship cycles, right? If you're stewarding correctly, then these things are going to be readily available, and reliably available within the landscape. So initially, that opportunity came to really steward at scale at the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, and this is a map showing just a portion of the ecological reserve. But in my early career at Chico State, I had some grad students who were interested in looking at the effects of fire in oak woodlands. They were focused on small mammals and reptiles, but I was thinking, okay, well, what opportunities we have to look at like vegetation response and that sort of thing. And so we began applying fire initially at these different plots. There were 9 of them that we identified as our blue oak plots on the reserve, which have now expanded to, I think, 45 plots that we have across different oak woodland ecosystems on the reserve, and that number continues to grow. In fact, I think, Hugh, some of your lab folks are doing comparative. You guys are doing some comparative work next to some of our black oak stuff. So, but we're collecting data out there and looking at it. And so we've got this kind of opportunistic burning that occurs when we see that it's needed, and through reading, like, when do things start to shift back to being non-native, and how much fuel is on the ground. Hey, it's a good time to burn that spot. Let's go do it. So those are, kind of the parameters. But the take home on this is that, as we start to bring fire into the landscape, there's a lot that I've learned since 2009 of just putting fire in. Seasonality was a really important thing. Like, if in this landscape, if I just chose to do springtime burning, what I would end up with is a bunch of fillery. So we primarily, again, are targeting that early wet season burn with initial flush of non-native grasses. And then we're able to achieve a lot more native species diversity in the aftermath of it. And so this next slide here illustrates kind of what that looks like. And this is a culturally informed burn out on the ecological reserve in a blue oak woodland. Here we're looking at the first entry of fire into a place that has a lot of non-native grasses and a mix of yellow star thistle. And then, the results out of this is that we end up with, a greater diversity of native species. And I would say roughly 60% of the species that we end up back in these areas end up being native species. And there's still going to be some non-natives that are mixed in, because we're never going to get rid of them. But the ultimate objective is to steward to have those non-native species behaving in the landscape, right? If I put those terms on it. So the next case study is kind of looking at the Valley Oak woodland side of things, and this is just an example of also recognizing rare ecosystems. So just as similar to the riparian systems that I referenced as being 2%, like Valley Oak woodlands in the state also represent about 2%. I've heard some people refer to it as like one of the rare ecosystem types in California, specifically as a single plant, but as an ecosystem, it's pretty rare. And so there's these pockets of valley oaks that occur in different areas along our riparian zones throughout the valley, and up into the foothills. But again, the fire stewardship aspect of it is a really critical one. And I started to dive into that pretty early on at a place called Rancho Llano Seco, which is a Mexican land grant here outside of Chico. And if you look at, I'll use the cursor here to illustrate it so that folks online can see it as well. But this is the boundary of Rancho Llano Seco, and these are the paleo channels of the Sacramento River as they come through the rancho. And each of those paleo channels is lined with valley oaks. And interestingly, like, this is a place that had frequent fire occurring on it through up till about the late 1980s. And then it stopped, mainly because of air quality concerns at the time. So initially, I had gone out to think about what fire reintroduction would be on this place. And one of the concerns that was noted in the landscape, and you can see it in the photograph in the center here, is that these hybrid black walnuts were starting to pop up all over the place in the middle of this forest. So one of the questions was, well, how could the hybrid black walnuts be kept at bay because of the burning? I'll say I show this because it's the entry point for thinking about how I start to work in the Valley Oak woodlands. I was never able to apply fire out here because the timing when we wanted to burn conflicted with the landowner's concerns that we were going to impact the duck hunting. So at some point, maybe we get to go back out there and do this, but or it's going to burn on its own. But that sets a stage for where we were able to apply it, and that takes us back to the Cosumnes River Preserve. So out at the Cosumnes River Preserve, some of you are familiar with that landscape. This is an area called the Costello Forest. It's east of Highway 99, south of the Cosumnes River, and north of Dillard Road. In 2013, I was able to work with our Miwok community to bring families together to burn out here in coordination with a bunch of professional firefighters who wanted to learn about what cultural fire stewardship looked like. So this is the first burn that was able to take place in this particular location in cultural memory in like 140 years. And so keep that in mind, like when as we're thinking about, time since fire and what the potential impacts are. This is a pretty small forest. In the next slide, you're going to see that it's 100 acres surrounded by agricultural fields, and you start to think, okay, how does island biogeography fit into this? Like comparatively, if I were, and I didn't say this when I was showing the black oaks, or the blue oak stuff, but in the Big Chico Creek Reserve across the blue oak plots, we have over 96 species identified on the plots. Comparatively, here at the Cosumnes River Preserve, there are 49 species, and 23 or so are native species and are all culturally important plants. But you can see the coarse woody debris. This is pre-burn conditions here. Um, what was interesting is that, coming in, there wasn't a lot of prep work. We didn't do ladder fuel reduction or anything in this regard, but we burned with the intent to clean things up, which is actually a traditional way of thinking about that stewardship. And this is the area that I'm referring to. So you can see the red polygon represents the Valley Oak woodland, and there's pockets of Valley Oak woodlands across the Cosumnes River. In fact, it's the Nature Conservancy's kind of hub species for why they chose to create the Cosumnes project in the first place was the Valley Oak protection. But over time, and this is a graphic that is true for both the blue oaks and the valley oaks, is that there's this time relationship that when we burn, we can increase the proportion of native cover. So that timing is really important to increase the native cover. The first year, you end up with basically a doubling of the amount of native species cover. And then 2 years out, it's like a quadrupling of the native species cover. So 2 years from fire, because the first year you have a reduction in competition, and then seed set, and then the second year you have the seed set. And usually by third year, that kind of meets its maximum. And then by year 5, it starts to drop back down again. This is something I've learned in like longer term research on this. That again, I'm sitting on the data. So what do I want to say here? Oops, too far. So let's then also talk about black oaks. And like as a fire researcher, I have generally stayed out of the higher elevation stuff because in my mind, like there's a ton of people doing research in conifers. So I'm less interested in conifers, but I live in a conifer forest, and that conifer forest should be an oak forest. So I'm kind of curious, like, okay, how does like protection of black oaks and conservation of black oaks fit into this framework as well? So this happens to be a site up the road from my house. This is Bureau of Land Management owned lands. And through work both on this land and at the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, we've been able to rope in some of the dynamics around the black oak forest stewardship. Interestingly, like I mentioned the diversity of species in the blue oak woodlands. I think I said 96. Very similar here in the valley or the black oak woodlands, so 94 species. Very few non-native species found in this particular section of the woods because of the elevation it's at. But stewardship timing is really important for what the outcomes are. So, again, we're targeting a late, kind of late dry season, early wet season burn, and then also trying to time it so that we're not impacting things during the growing season. So not, like if it was say an early spring burn, that might impact, like the leafing out of the trees and that sort of thing if we get too much heat going up into the canopy. And we have burned in the spring in some of these places, but it's always in a way of doing it mindful of like trying to do it before the budding out and that sort of thing of the oaks. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide, advancing here. So this is just an example of that. This is actually from the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve in an area that's mixed conifer, but mostly black oak and live oak dominated. we can see the introduction of fire in this. In this case, this was in the picture up there was in February of 20, 2019, and then this is in like just a few months later in the spring. So we have, this really amazing flush of native plants. This is all great pollinator habitat. Like if you're into bees, like this is a great place to come and study bees. I'm interested, but I have way too many other things to look at. I'd rather actually be looking at birds. So like that's maybe the next thing on this. But the point is that we're able to steward and achieve a really great diversity of native species. And again, it's this cultural connection. Every single one of these species that I see flowering is a culturally important plant. So like that timing is really important to maintain those conditions for these plants in this place. Um, so, kind of key takeaways from these applied studies across and I'm going to say that this is very collectively for both the riparian and the oak woodland stuff, is that, when we think about the culturally significant species, generally speaking, like they've all evolved with fire. And generally speaking, like this approach to applying fire to the landscape is good for them, but some timing is better than others, right? So paying attention to timing is critical in some cases. And then, thinking about those opportunities for reducing cover of non-native species, allows for those native perennials in particular to take ground. And if you can pay attention to what their population dynamics are doing, most of our native perennial grasses like blue wild rye, California brome, that are common in these areas, are short-lived perennials. So if you're not maintaining them with fire, they're going to decrease ultimately and probably give way back to non-native grasses coming back into dominance. And then I also pose this idea as like in this an observation that like these higher burn severities and like the indicators of this is when you have a log that maybe a snag that falls and burns during the fire, and you end up with this nice little skeleton of the tree showing up in the landscape, that red soil. We have some really cool species that pop out of those that are totally underrepresented. I see that as a research need. Like I have one of these days I want to get a grad student to just focus in on go look for red dirt and like tell me what's coming out of it in comparison to what's immediately adjacent to it. And I see that across all of these studies is that when that happens, we end up with some things that are totally underrepresented in the landscape, sometimes not even represented in the landscape. Um, this is a slide that I want to share because I'm just thinking about this idea of like observations and opportunities, right? So like as I mentioned, I live on property that is mixed conifer, and I'm seeing one that in early settler notes it was noted that it was dominated by black oak and sugar pine, and ponderosa pine, the damn weedy plant, is all over it now, and I'm trying to figure out how do I reduce it, right? So fire is the tool that I'm using for that. And this is just an example of how that kind of stewardship might help to reclaim oak dominance in the landscape. And it's working. Like it's turning out that some of these conifers really don't like the kind of fire that's being put into it. But at the same time, the oaks are beginning to really thrive and benefit from it. And you'll see some examples of that in a little bit as well. The other side of it is then also thinking about where we've done culturally informed prescribed burning, and you know what do we do with our evergreen oaks? Like there's a ton of evergreen oaks that are out there, and they're not necessarily the most conducive to burning in some cases. And we had this interesting opportunity that came up on one of these burns where we had some unintentional consequences of ignition patterns, a crew that wasn't following the lead, and lit from the bottom on this left-hand side of the slide, and it torched out underneath these live oaks, which wasn't intended on the prescription. It wasn't an objective of the burn. But what we noticed is that we opened up the canopy of these live oaks that are smothering the places where these deciduous oaks were trying to come in from. And so this is another thing that potentially could be looked at, right? Like we could be looking at how prescriptions can help us to shift from evergreen oaks back to deciduous oaks if that's an objective in place. And why I bring that up is actually relevant in the sense that a lot of our landscape has gone without fire for so long that it's hard for us to see um, the woodlands to the forest, so to speak, right? So this is an example from the Big Chico Creek Reserve where in the very middle of this slide, you see valley oaks, that are growing there. And surrounding those valley oaks are mostly canyon live oaks. And I like to think about canyon live oaks as fire, kind of shadow species. Like they live in the places that fire doesn't generally get into. That's, like they're in the crevices. I'll call them crevice live oaks, until the absence of fire. And then they march back out on the landscape again. And so if in this context, if you understand the landscape where we're at, we're sitting between, we're in the middle of where two meadows are located that are known village sites. And those villages are surrounded by both blue oaks and valley oaks. And those villages would have had a lot of fire in them. And as you walk through this forest, you see the remnants of these older valley oaks that are there that are slowly being choked out by the presence of these canyon oaks. Okay, so that's one observation I think is interesting as an opportunity. Now I want to talk about something a little bit different, and that this is another observation, and that is the consequences of frequent high severity fire. And I see this in a lot of places. One example nearby to us would be like going into the foothills, west of Winters, right? Going up into Berryessa. Very similar situation there, where frequent fires over the last 2 decades probably have really reduced the amount of blue oaks. In this case, these are fires in the area south of Oroville. We've got the Swedes fire that happened in 2013, which is highlighted in the yellow. And then the wall fire, which happened in 2017, highlighted in blue. And you can see in just a simple, looking at this, that there has been a type conversion affected by these fires. As it turns out, like CAL FIRE has been very heavily engaged in doing fuels work down here since these fires, but I don't know if it's going to be conducive to the regeneration of the oak woodlands that were and should be there. So I'm curious to look at these areas. This is something that's been on my mind for a while. When I get more bandwidth, I'll come back to this and like look at it. But I think it's an important point because as we consider the proximity of these kinds of fires and the frequency that are happening in different areas of the state, I wonder, like we've talked about the rarity of valley oaks, but at what point do our blue oak remnant patches also become this kind of rare system? Another thing that I want to mention is the role of, I'll call it brush. I'll use the CAL FIRE term as brush, right? Sorry for folks on CAL FIRE on this, but I think about the firefighters that I know, they just call it brush. So it's like the manzanita, the ceanothus, all those things that they come back after fire. They come back from being exposed in the sunlight, and they play a very important role. One, as soil fixers. A lot of them are nitrogen fixing plants. They prepare the soil for the success of the forest to come back in. I started to notice this on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, where in 1999 we had wildfires that came off the rims of the canyon through lightning ignitions and backed into the canyon itself. And in 10 to 15 years time, we start to notice that oaks are starting to reemerge through the shrubs and or brush. And so it's like in our stewardship and post-fire landscapes, like we're often trying to reduce the amount of brush that's present, right? But the question is like, if we're trying to get back to a forested landscape, shouldn't we maybe be thinking about what's the role of these shrubs as a nursery for oaks? And this is just an example of, a black oak coming up through now needle cast manzanita that is just an illustration of that point. As Hugh mentioned in the introduction, the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve has been pretty heavily impacted by the park fire, and I do want to spend a few moments just talking about that. So, yeah, it's as I said, I'm not that interested in wildfires, but there's some interesting opportunities around this because in all the time I've worked on indigenous fire issues, the question has always come up, well, how does it affect the outcomes when wildfires happen? We've got some great examples in Australia where I also do work of where those fires make a huge difference. But we haven't been able to put fire at the scale to truly make a huge difference here in California. And yet, like I see some things already that I'm really hopeful for in the places where we have stewarded on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, where um, our initial assessment of things is that where we have stewarded have a higher survival rate. The oaks have a higher survival rate where we have been applying fire. And it's not just the oaks, it's like where frequent recent fires have occurred, the outcomes and behavior of fire that burned through this landscape. And this was a very high severity fire to just illustrate, some of this. In this reach, this fire was backing in the morning, second, day of the park fire, backing down this canyon. And then soon as the afternoon winds and morning winds hit it, it raced up this canyon inside here. And then it was hot on both sides of the canyon, wind driven, both sides. Pretty much everything was white ash. Not a lot of mosaic going on. We had 3 firewalls that actually hit, one here, one further up here, and then another one up here that came off the canyon. So that gives you a sense of like what was going on out there. But these pictures are showing like this past spring's efforts out at the ecological reserves on some of our plots and what it looks like in November, just a few months after. And what you notice is that like there's still some living canopy. Whereas places that stewardship wasn't taking place, where no fire had been introduced, like some of those canopies, they're gone, but they're basil sprouting. Not dead, but they're basil sprouting, right? And I think that's interesting because it's like, well, at what scale does that occur at? So, oops, how did I get there? So this is just using some Sentinel data, just a quick, look at it. What I want to point out is that this is one of the areas that I showed earlier with the black oak forest, where we'd done 3 entries of fire in about a 8-year time period. Now it's got the park fire on it. Multiple fires in and around this meadow complex here, like lots of fire maintenance. And then scattered about here, these areas up here, we have plots up in there, lots of fire happening there, and then similarly down in this area here. And then you look at this. I just want to point this out. Totally jumping out of the oak system here. But in November I think it was November of 2023, Cal Fire did a burn. I think they said it was 600 acres, but I mapped it out as about 250. But either way, like this is green box that's there, right? So recent regenerating chaparral. Okay, they crushed brush, they ball and chain this, and then lit it on fire, and it's regenerating, and this fire didn't even touch it. Pretty cool outcome. Okay, it has me thinking about the opportunities around the chaparral as well. Okay, back to, am I there? Yeah, I'm there. Sorry, I'm trying to track where my cursor is. So I want to talk about emerging opportunities because, as I said, like there's some really cool stuff that's going on. People are taking a lot more interest, particularly in the last 2 years. I've had people coming out of the woodworks asking me about fire and riparian. I'm like, okay, what's going on here, right? So I want to talk about that for just briefly and say, like, one, we've got some really cool areas along our river systems here in the Central Valley that have been restored through work that River Partners and the Nature Conservancy and other partners have done. This is an example from what is soon to be, I guess it's technically labeled as the next state park in California, Dos Rios. And for the last couple of years, we've had these conversations with when are we going to put fire back into this place? And we're in the midst of planning this. These are actual burn units that are in some of the oldest, I think they're currently 10 years old, restored riparian floodplain. And this picture down here is actually from this general area right here. So it gives you a sense of the fuel conditions. That photograph was taken in December of this past year. So, like we've got a lot of dead component and we know we need to get some fire in there and we want to do it before it transfers to state parks land so that this could actually be a place that's culturally stewarded. And so we're on track for that. I'm waiting for air quality to get back to me. And then I'm hoping we don't lose the opportunity before like those cultural indicators tell us we shouldn't be burning this season. If not, we'll pick it up next fall. The next one I want to highlight is also coming back to the Cosumnes River Preserve. And this is I'm going to say this is where the patience comes in. So and Hugh said, like I started out as an undergrad here at Davis. During the time I was an undergrad, I volunteered at the Cosumnes River Preserve. The floods in 96, 97 occurred. And as an intern working out there, we had to prepare a trip during flood stage for then Secretary Babbitt from the Department of Interior to make a pass through on a canoe trip through this forest. And I said, at that time, I said to the Bureau of Land Management manager of the Cosumnes River Reserve, like, have you guys ever thought about burning this? Oh no, we can't burn here. Like John Fremont said that this was a riparian thicket. Okay. So that was 30 years ago. Weird. Okay, I'm getting old. Not quite, I won't accept that, but but I'm getting old. 30 years ago, the conversation. So this past summer, I get an email from the Nature Conservancy. Hey, we're thinking we want to do some more burning out at the preserve. I said, great. I'm happy to work with you guys on it. They said, I said, why don't you send me a map of the place that you're thinking about? I didn't suggest anything to them. They send me this map, I pull it up, and I'm like, that's the tall forest. And I sent this long response back of the whole history of the conversation of this. And I'm like, this is what the conversation was 30 years ago, And finally we're there. So this was the day before I took the picture of Dos Rios. I just did a big Central Valley sweep of riparian areas that I plan to burn. And this is what it looks like. It's it's crazy, right? Um, it kind of needs a hot fire, to be honest with you. But there's some punky stuff up in the canopy. There's some snags. There's the vine component, and then there's this understory that's mostly all ash. And yeah, this is the challenge. So perhaps by next fall, and I don't have to worry about the data collection because TNC's got a lot of data plots out here. Uh, I can just come out and light it on fire and have some more data to add to the data set. I'm almost done, so then I'll get to questions here. So, this is just kind of bringing it in to really understand the choices that we have. We can continue to experience the severe wildfires and really that idea of what the elders talked about is, the effects of those rampant wildfires versus, the stewardship opportunities and feedbacks that exist through Indigenous stewardship. I think that from climate resilience, biodiversity, water, fire in general standpoint, I think the choice is pretty obvious. But we have to be willing to accept that we have some challenges and we need to make some effort to get there. And with that, I'll leave this last slide, which happens to be along Big Chico Creek on the Big Chico Creek campus, December of 2023. First burn in 140 years, I think, for Mechoopda tribe to be able to burn at this location. And we did this burn, very small, very plant-specific burn on campus. Was pretty awesome. This year we were planning to burn, and we were looking at December, and then Bidwell Mansion burned around that time period. So it's like, well, let's hold off for a little bit. I'm still planning to burn out there though. So, but with that, I saw a hand come up in the back, and we'll go to questions. I think we have some time now.
We do. We probably have at least 5 minutes, and depending on what's coming up.
Sorry, I talked too long.
It was very interesting, and I was not about to stop you.
Yeah, you could have done that. That's fine. Thank you.
Great.
Fire away. So I'll repeat it for our online listeners, that the question is there a discrepancy between Indigenous knowledge of fire regimes versus like Western science-based regimes? Generally, yeah, I would say there is a discrepancy in that a lot of places that we look at, I would say, tend to mask or exclude what that Indigenous stewardship role is. So we can look at, I don't know, I'll use the examples from the conifer forest because there are obviously tons of them with dendrochronology. But it's like we can look at those and say, well, there's these fire frequencies that are occurring. But then you might ask yourself, like, well, is that truly reflective of what that Indigenous stewardship was in that place? Are those Indigenous fires being recorded by all those scars? Or were there more that were occurring in between? So, I didn't necessarily introduce the concept in the talk today, but from an Indigenous perspective, that you're constantly looking for those indicators of when and what to burn. And those indicators are based on species and conditions and those sorts of things. And one of the basic elements of that is when it looks sickly, it's time to burn it. And so, like I think we can all experience this. Like we looked at certain places, we go for a hike and we look at the land and we're like, man, that doesn't look all that healthy. So like that's the general concept. And so like if you're using those indicators at the lower end of the spectrum, like when on a shorter fire return interval spectrum, I would say like that might be, well, I need to burn to maintain the productivity of this grass. And this grass after, 2, 3 years, like its seed production drops or whatever, we need to burn, right? But does that grass absolutely have a fire return interval that's that short? Probably not. And that's where maybe there's a discrepancy that occurs, right? I don't know. So definitely some thoughts on it. And I can't see if there's questions online. So if somebody's seen, there's a lot of questions. Okay. All I see is like me.
Let's do one from the online folks, then we'll come back to the room.
Okay, someone's asking, what is your success rate from planning a burn to actually executing it? And what are the reasons for it succeeding or failing?
I would say I have a pretty good success rate in planning and implementing burns. I mean, nice thing in the sense of like the new legislation within the state of California under SB 332 and AB 642 for defining cultural burning is that there isn't a requirement for having a burn plan. So you can look at a place in the landscape, and if you have intent to burn, say in a meadow system, and you go to that meadow on that particular day, and it's not right, you can pivot to another location and burn. So that's a pretty fortunate thing. But on a prescribed burn side of it, I can say that, when we plan burns, we generally are able to implement them soon, like after we've done it. In this case, when I'm working with different landowning partners, like the project at Dos Rios, like I mentioned, I wrote the air quality manager in mid-December about that, and I'm still waiting for a response. So like my window of opportunity for this year may have closed, but I'm not going to see that fire happen, I don't think. So if that's weird to say, not. Yeah.
I was curious if you've noticed a density effect in oak woodlands, similar to conifer forests that tend to get bigger without the introduction of fire. And when you put fire back in, it reduces the density of large trees, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question for online is if I see I'll call it a densification of oaks in the absence of frequent fire. And I've seen the signatures of it for sure. I mean, like that example that I showed of the canyon live oaks is definitely an example of it, although it's a different species. But I also think, in the absence of frequent fires taking out sick trees, like that woodland becomes more of a forest on its own. So, one of the unintended consequences of the burn we did at the Costello Forest, and on the map, I don't know how many of you noticed, but there were dots on the map. Those dots were 25 trees that were either fire scarred or had other vulnerabilities that burned during the fire. we didn't plan to burn those trees out, but I wasn't crying over it either because, you know, I was like, well, we're making space for the next generation of trees to come in because there isn't a diversity of age class structure out there. So I think that's an important factor. And I think sometimes, you know, when we have at least an initial run of a high severity fire that maybe does top kill some trees, um, you know, we can then use subsequent fires to regenerate that and reestablish age class structure and densities in the oak woodlands. A lot of I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to do research around that. Yeah.
So I was asking, in regards to burning at your property where you noticed the ponderosa pines responding negatively to the fires while the oaks were making a comeback, how long have you been burning at your property and at what frequency? When did you notice results?
Yeah, I have to say that a lot of the ponderosa pine work actually is more more chainsaw driven. But they don't like they don't stump sprout, I'll tell you that. But what has decreased is more of the younger classes of fire sensitive conifers like Douglas fir. So even larger Douglas firs that, you know, I'll say, you know, 8 to 10-inch DBH tend to, I'm noticing like they don't tolerate it very well. And that's even with a low intensity fire. So like I can do an initial pass and see their reduction. And then, you know, once they're gone, I can use my saw for making some firewood out of them. Younger age classes, though, I will say this. So younger age classes, like once we get to pole size for most of those conifers, that's where the except for Douglas fir, the first entry with fire is not necessarily going to take care of it. But if we're in that pole class or lower, I see a great reduction in cover. So I've you know I have examples of places where incense cedar, ponderosa pine, even sugar pine, which I'm trying to actually keep, I guess, unintentionally lose some of them. Again, I'm not crying over it because I have others, and you know whatever. But it's the oaks that are coming back in, right? So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking on it. Come on a field trip, like just come on a field trip, like that's what really. And I know Hugh had an intent of doing a field trip, but I teach tomorrow, so that's you know.
Yeah, we would have liked to usually if you can do it, but the fire science retreat is gonna be right in your backyard.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, and if it's cool and moist during June, like maybe we could do a burn. I don't know. Like, wouldn't it be fun? Well, freak, it happens. It happens. I've done burns on June 2nd. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of already touched on this a bit in some of the other questions, but someone's asking how different are cultural burns from other prescribed burning that is occurring in California that is not explicitly aligned with indigenous practices?
Well, I think in general, like the differences between cultural burning versus prescribed burning is that cultural burning in a lot of respects is ultimately tied to cultural activities, right? So life waste types of things, having access to plant materials for weaving, hunting, food collection, those kind of things. And so the intent when burning is occurring is that the burning will then provide a platform to come back and to engage, to harvest or do those sorts of things. Where a lot of times with prescribed burning, it's burning and then like you walk away from it, you don't come back to it. So like part of the reason why I can, you know, share a lot of kind of, I'll call it more anecdotal observational, is that I'm always back in the places that I've burned across the seasons, seeing the frequencies of when and what, you know, what's changing, and then paying attention to when we need to be putting fire back into it again. I think on the Big Chico Creek Reserve, I think we've been pretty up until this point, obviously with the park fire happening, it's a little bit different, but you know, we've been able to steward places in frequencies that in a lot of other places, it hasn't happened. And that's our intent going forward too, is that we plan to burn as our solution to reshape that landscape, you know, to be more fire resilient going forward.
Hey, Joan, I think we have time for one more. There's a use of this room now.
In the room.
Hey, there we go.
There's something that I keyed in on, which is if you don't burn continuously or every 3 to 5 years, then the weedy species come back. And when we do restoration, we always say, oh, we're gonna plant these species to hold back the invasive.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's just more of an observation that was.
Sure. So I'll repeat again for folks online is that the observation is that in restoration, we tend to plant native species with the intent that they're going to hold the non-natives out. But then there's a cycle of stewardship that maybe is required to maintain them. And I can think of multiple examples, like drive along Highway 45 between here and Chico and look at some of the old areas that were restored for grassland in the Sac River complex. And, you know, it's like there's places that used to be dominated by native grasses. They were planted as restored native grasses, and they're fields of mustard now. You know, and I'm just like, man, if Fish and Wildlife would have stewarded that, it could have been maintained that way. And like there's plenty of examples of that all over the place. So fire is vital for these species to survive in places. And I know, you know, in my early career, you know, when I worked at Fish and Wildlife, I would deal with restoration folks who were like, yeah, we're gonna plant this with natives. And I'd say, well, when are you gonna burn it? And oh no, you can't burn it. You know, it's like, no, you're gonna have to burn it. It's going to burn at some point anyway. So like choose it. Yeah.
Should we live on the edge and do one more question? Sure.
When they start pushing the door down, then
Can I ask, what are the most exciting anecdotes or surprises by introducing young students and young Indigenous folks to using fire for restoration? Any suggestions on constructing classes around burns?
you know, my favorite thing to do, and I introduce a lot of my students to fire. The reserve has been an awesome place for doing that. And for the longest time, you know, we've always generally been able to do it without having people be fire line qualified. So I can have a group of people who've never been around fire before in a restoration class or in my fire class and invite them out, you know, to the site. And I always ask this question, who's afraid of fire? And somebody will raise their hand, and then that person becomes the person to light the fire. And I have gotten some real like fire enthusiasts out of that, you know. We've now got like 45 employees working on the ecological reserve, and a lot of them got their first dose of this through that sort of activity. So I think it's important. The other benefit of that is, and we've had a lot of conversations today about policy. You know, if we want to get the public and our policymakers to understand this, we need to put the torch in their hand, because then they'll have that same connection. And so, yeah, I think it's a super powerful tool.
That's awesome. Thank you. Anyway.
Yeah. Thanks for folks online waiting.